Cool. How's it going, everyone? I'm Jimmy. I know in the program it says IoT, assessing IoT surveillance. As this talk kind of progressed, it turned into more just me taking apart the Arlo security cameras and base station. I am going to talk about the process I followed taking these apart. So this is going to be a pretty beginner and intermediate level talk. I think there's a huge lack of presentations that go through like actually tearing down devices and the thought process of someone like actually doing this. I see a lot of beginners told over and over again, just pick a target and try harder. I don't see that as being very helpful. So hopefully this gives someone more insight into how to actually like take one of their devices and start going at it. This presentation was put together like a month or two ago, and I haven't looked at it since. This is my second presentation of the weekend. So I apologize for any repetition or stumbling over this I do, because the order of these slides is as much a surprise to me as it is to you. So hopefully we get going on that. All right, a little bit about me. I'm a security researcher at Tenable. Thanks to them for like letting me do this kind of stuff for my day job. It's really all you need to know about me. These are my dogs. This is my cat. He's the favorite. All of this is irrelevant to the talk, so I'm just going to go ahead and get moving on. A little bit about what we're going to talk about. This talk is not going to last the full 50 minutes. Since it's beginner-oriented, like I see a lot of people kind of drone on and fall asleep for talks that actually last the full length, especially like post-lunch coma, and most of you look hungover from last night. So I'm going to talk a little bit about like past surveillance systems, more recent trends and surveillance systems for IoT devices and like the cheaper stuff that we see everywhere these days. Then talk about the actual research process I took taking apart the Arlo cameras. So past surveillance systems, we're talking 5, 10, 15, even 20 years ago. Wireless cheap cameras haven't really been mainstream up until the last like maybe 5 or 6 years. It used to be anytime you went to like a gas station or a small convenience store, it would cost like $5,000-$6,000 just to run a single CCTV. Not only that, you can't actually buy that equipment, or you couldn't at the time yourself. You have to call someone and have them install it, and then set up your VHS player and TV in the back to actually monitor it. So none of this was actually accessible to everyday consumers. I remember when I worked at like Cold Stone Creamery as a teenager, anytime we needed to monitor the security feeds, we had to call an external company in. Even today for enterprises, you can't actually go out and buy this stuff yourself. You have to contact a third-party distributor, have them come and install it. And then if you ever want to update that software, you have to call them again. They charge you like a $10,000 fee just to update it. So a lot of this equipment was very old, very much hardwired connections that you had to run cable for. Not really the most consumer friendly. So you didn't see security cameras on, people's doorbells like you do today. Moving into like the present time, this stuff got really, really popular. Devices are now only a couple $100. They're pretty much accessible everywhere. In terms of new functionality, there's nothing new. The devices that existed 5 years ago exist today. There's just a shitload more of them. Mostly because they're only $100, $200 for an entire kit of 2 or 3 cameras to assess your entire property. They're all wireless. They're easy enough to set up that my mother can do it. So that's saying something. And as proof that they're everywhere, both neighbors on either side of me in our new house have CFE Save cameras. The guy down the street has an entire Ubiquity setup. I have Arlo. The neighbor across the street uses the Blink security cameras. I can't think of anyone that doesn't have a Ring doorbell monitor anymore. So these things are very prevalent in our everyday lives. Now, targeting Arlo, why did I pick Arlo? Well, I needed a security camera. It was Black Friday, so I bought one of these. That's really the entire story of how I picked this. It also is really popular, and there wasn't much research on it. So I saw an opportunity there just to kind of start taking this apart. The last published stuff was back in 2015, up until I started taking over these. And there were only 2 CVEs, which is kind of odd for a big company like Netgear to only have 2 CVEs for one of their like biggest products. So I was kind of curious what was going on there. Did they actually put a lot of money into securing these devices? No. Or like, was there something else going on? And unfortunately, I can't actually talk about that something else. But if you look at our disclosure timeline, you'll get a big hint of what's going on there. So first, taking apart the device. After you buy it, take it out of the box. All it is, little base station, camera, some cables. In order to play with it all, there's a web application which is Flash-based, so don't use it. But the mobile apps are actually pretty solid and pretty easy to use. It really is as easy as plugging in, pressing the sync buttons, and letting it go. As soon as you turn everything on and sync it, it's working very well, very high quality images. The motion detection was pretty flawless. And it does something interesting that I hadn't seen in many of these devices before. It actually does all of the network segmentation for you. As security practitioners, we tend to have this, mantra of put it on its own VLAN or make sure it's not on your main network. The base station here actually does that for you. It segregates all of the cameras onto their own little wireless network. So obviously still put your base station on its own VLAN, but it'll handle all of the actual segmenting for you. It does sync via WPS. One thing I don't mention in the talk, we all kind of roll our eyes when we see WPS, but they did a good job and have all of the brute forcing stuff disabled. So it is actually pretty solid, and they have some MAC filtering, which easy enough to bypass, but for the typical user, you can only pair Arlo cameras with it. It will eventually kick you off if you don't have a Netgear registered MAC address. So before I actually dig into the device myself, I wanted to look at what was published before me. The only information out there, aside from a few teardowns on Chinese websites or the FCC ID.io teardown images, were 2 things from New Sky Security. They really had 3 big vulnerabilities that they published, but only 2 of them were assigned CVEs, and it dealt with password flaws. So when you originally bought the device, if you reset it after the initial setup, it would just reset that internal Wi-Fi password to 1234567 and then anyone could connect to that Wi-Fi network and start man-in-the-middling your cameras. So when they reported that to Netgear, their fix was to make it very predictable. It was literally a word list on the device that you could connect to. And all they did was pull a random word from that file, and that was the password. So if you had access to that file, you could still connect to any network just by trying all of the passwords. After going through their information, I'll talk about the man-in-the-middling they did on the camera networks here in a little bit. I kind of wanted to take a look at what our actual external attack surface is. Scanning the device externally, there's only a single port open, 5061. That's for encrypted SIP traffic, which is typically used by voice over IP network phones. Unfortunately, there's not a lot that can be done with that port. I'll mention that again at the end of the presentation. We know all communication happens via Wi-Fi. There's no other radios or antennas on devices. We can tell that, 1, by looking at the hardware, and 2, by seeing what the device is registered with the FCC under. And then there's the obvious cloud connection. These are always on devices. In order to actually access your camera streams, you have to go through Arlo. Everything goes to them. I think we're all familiar with that process by now. Looking at the device, taking it apart, there's a couple of antennas. There are a couple of shield cans that cover the wireless components to prevent interference. Then there's this magical thing here. That's an open serial port on the device with no other protections. There's nothing funny about it. It conforms to the SPI spec directly. So all you got to do is just connect to it. And what prior research to me did was connect to this and it drops a root shell. There's no authentication, no nothing. Fortunately for me, these devices have been updated since then. I'll talk more about actually connecting to that and how I wound up getting access here in just a second. But let's review the attack surface really quick. Since I'm looking at primarily the base station, since the cameras aren't exposed on your own network, there's that SIP interface port we'll talk about again later. There are binaries that we can hopefully get to through the serial interface. There's the internal network, and then the actual networking components of the device. So it's a pretty locked down attack surface. There's not a lot we can really do with this. So New Sky Security did write up their pinout after figuring these out. I'm a big fan of trust but verify when it comes to hardware, especially since there are several different models of the base station. When Netgear actually acquired Arlo, there was these old tacky plastic round hubs that they used. Nowadays, they're less than glamorous plastic matte hubs. So the hardware is more or less the same, but just in case they change the pinout, it's helpful to figure this out yourself. Not going to go through the process of figuring out the pinout. I do have a write-up separate from this talk that you can use to find that. But once you figure out the pinout and solder up, you can connect to it. If your connection is right when you boot up the device, you'll start getting a bunch of boot logs and output. We'll come to this slide again later, but you can see all of the mounted memory addresses from the flash chips there. So 0 to 8,000 or 80,000 is the boot partition. Then you've got some NVRAM, you've got the rootfs and whatnot. Fortunately, after it boots, you've got some authentication. This was not present in any other research that I found. It was just a BusyBox login prompt that didn't accept anything. There was no single user mode I could boot into. So I had to figure out a way around that. If you Control C when things booting up, you can actually access the bootloader. This thing uses the CFE or Common Firmware Environment bootloader, pretty common among most Netgear and home consumer routing devices. And you can use it to show all of the connected flash devices. You can monitor NVRAM values, just kind of pull things apart and try to see what's going on. So they had the special values called UART username and UART password, just written like this in the NVRAM. These look like base 64 values that decode to MD5 hashes. They are not. So I had to come up with a different way to do it. CFE has a save command. If you have a TFTP network or server on your network, you can use the save command to transfer arbitrary memory from the device or any flash region to your own home server. So once you have these memory regions, you can just write them to your own server and then have the firmware that way. A lot of vendors will disable this feature in their bootloader. Arlo does not. So after we get that and run strings, they literally have the decryption routines in plain text in the firmware image. So the username and password is just ng-root and ng-base, and you're good to go. So all you do is have to log in. We now have root access to the device. So once we're in, the file system's pretty simple. There's not really a ton on it. There are a few configuration commands we can use and run just to get version information, network information. There is an HTTP interface that's disabled by default, but the username and password, if you happen to enable it, is just admin and password. Super secure. Let's see. And then there's the WPA key, which is encrypted in the NVRAM and very difficult to decrypt just based on its length. And I'll mention that key here again in a minute. But taking a look at the services running on the device, this slide isn't super helpful because it's just a jumble of addresses, but we can see that there's only one service listening globally, and then everything else happens to be listening on the internal network interface that we can't access without being on that network. Looking at what processes are actually running that run on these ports, there's VZDaemon, Xagent, Xagent Watchdog. The Xagent stuff, totally irrelevant. All it does is monitor to make sure the rest of the VZ daemon is running correctly. If it's not, it just reboots the device. There's the SIP interface that I keep talking about. I hate it. I have no idea what it does still. Again, I'll keep talking about that later. There's these internal stuff, port 4000, 4100, and 4200. They are only listening on the internal network. They're what the cameras use to connect to the base station. It's what all the video streams, audio feeds will actually go over. Then it's listening internally on port 80, which was weird because the cameras never touch this port. As it turns out, this is running a hidden administrative console. It's got three little API commands. One is file, one is pass through, and one is version. Version just spits out model information on the device, but pass through and file allow you to download and upload arbitrary files to the device. Since VZ daemon contains all functionality for the device, it'll periodically run ping just to check the network access is working. So if you overwrite ping with your own file, because you have root access, you now have full execution on the device. Moving a little bit quick here, but I'm just going to go ahead and start jumping into summary of the findings. We've got insufficient UART protection. So really not the biggest deal in the world, but it's very helpful for the home routing community or home automation communities to be able to kind of connect to these devices, read the configs themselves. One thing I see on Arlo forums a lot is the range of the base station is really, really short. So if you have a long shotgun home or just a large property, you can't really run that many cameras too far away. But if you have access to the configs and you can get your password, you can set up your own range extenders that Arlo still doesn't provide themselves. It helps you just expand your environment a little bit. There were a lot of plain text passwords in there. I don't have them all listed here. In the corresponding blog post, I have them all spelled out for you. But flets and flets at flets and guest and gear UCP, gear guy, gear dog, some of those are already public, but some of them, no idea what they go to, but there are a bunch of PPOE services that go on. Since I don't own those or access them, I didn't try to do push any further since this was company related research. If anyone wants to look at that, feel free, but please tell me if you actually find anything. Through the disclosure process, Netgear and Arlo said they didn't do anything. Take that for what you will. The main finding I found, though, is there was a big network misconfiguration. That internal network, if you specify the main router as, or the main interface as your gateway, you can access that internal network. Since the entire base station is based on a previously released Netgear wireless extender, it's still just a router itself. So you can ping the cameras, you can access those internal administrative consoles. So if you're on the same LAN as the base station, you now have root access on the device. Just kind of as proof of that, just specifying my routing table to go to that internal interface from LAN, I can access the syslog and just view anything on the device. Man-in-a-million cameras, all configs passed on that internal network. Since it's a Wi-Fi network that's pretty hard to connect to if you don't have the password, Arlo assumes everything there is safe. So everything is sent in plain text. Video is not encrypted. If you man in the middle of it, it's just an RTSP stream. So you can live stream any video from any of the cameras. I didn't want to include the picture here just because it's obfuscated and I didn't want my own home stuff broadcast publicly. Also in the image, all of Arlo's private keys for firmware encryption and decryption are included within the binaries on the device. So if anyone wants to download their firmware, it's all there. You can use these to decrypt it. None of these have been previously released except in a couple of blog posts I've made. The disclosure process, this was one of the longer disclosures I've ever done. I know you can't really read that, but more or less, I disclosed in March, and then had multiple weekly follow-ups with the vendor. There was a lot of back and forth, then a lot of silence from the vendor, then a lot of back and forth. Then finally they're like, we're working on it. So we waited, and then we finally published after they like surprise released on us. That being said, they did a great job. They actually patched the issues. The UART stuff they can't fix without recalling devices, so that's still a problem. But in general, they actually did a really good job, especially since the device in general, the attack surface is pretty limited. Now, getting to that SIP interface, my theory is this SIP interface is for the doorbell cameras and microphones. I can tell from the mobile app that it may have been used for device enrollment at one point in time. It doesn't appear to anymore. But within the mobile app, the passwords for the actual SIP console are hard-coded. So the username and password are just 1025 for both. So if anyone has one of the doorbells and wants to try connecting to it with any of the PJ SIP utilities, please do, because I'm really curious to know if they actually work. Other things that could be looked at, the cloud communications, they do certificate pinning and verification and everything very, very well. It's all very well handled. I didn't try to do any testing on the cloud networks myself. I really don't like touching things that I don't own. If you do, please let me know. Any of their extra credentials, no idea what they do still. So if anyone wants to take those and go forward, that's all fair game. Again, the goal of this talk was more just talking about like my process of like what did I look at, what did I find important, and kind of walk through. In terms of security posture, this is one of the better devices I've looked at. I expected this to be like a really easy target with like CVs just to fall out as I shook it. Unfortunately, that was not the case. The biggest downside with this kind of stuff for me is I don't like the always on, always connected devices. I don't like my data going somewhere out of my control. That being said, it's cheap and very easy for consumers to use. So there's a little bit of give and take there. In terms of non-security related stuff, it's great that we can like contribute to like the open source routing communities by releasing the decryption keys so they can modify this firmware and hopefully make it a little bit better and more accessible in terms of more control over like your information. I kind of blitzed through all of that. So are there any questions? That's an automatic process. So since they're always on, if the camera pings out constantly to check for updates, as soon as it sees one, it will like download the update and bring it back. All of that process is very well pinned and secure. I couldn't man in the middle of it. I couldn't do anything to kind of like intercept those updates. Anyone else? Awesome. Well, thanks for your time.